Hey everyone, it's Jen, and I'm here today with my March wrap-up. The first book that I read in March was The Aeronaut's Windlass by Jim Butcher. So in this book, there are a couple different point of view characters, and the first one is Grim, who is a captain, and he has a flying ship, because the towers are very high in the air, and there's this sort of cool crystal technology that lets their ships fly, and so that was why I picked this book up in the first place. I was very interested in the idea of a book that had flying ships. The other main characters are all sort of training to be part of the Tower Guard, and it seems like the Spire really needs a guard because the main plot of this book is about another Spire trying to infiltrate the place where they all live. So I didn't feel like the world building in this book was as fleshed out as it could have been. I was very curious to know a lot more about this world and sort of where it came from, and to have a lot more information about it. Although the information that we did get was very cool and interesting, I would have liked to see a lot more about, especially about their system of magic and the crystals and all of that. Although this is the first book in a series, so it could be that there's more development later in the series, but I would have liked some more of that right away. One thing that I did like about this book were the characters. They all felt very unique and well-rounded. They all had their own sort of flaws, but also strengths and different weaknesses and stuff. But I didn't really enjoy the plot of this book. It seemed like it was constant action. There was never really any time for sort of quieter character moments. It seemed as soon as there was one fight, there was also another, and then another, and another, and another. And after they finished fighting in the Spire, they had to go fight a naval battle in the air. And I was like, oh my god, like, there should be a much higher death toll in this book. But I did very much enjoy it. I gave this book 3.5 out of 5 stars. And I will definitely be picking up the next one in the series because I'm excited to see how it develops. The next book that I read in March was The Portable Bedlam by Elizabeth Mackenzie. So this was a quirky little book, and the best thing about it were the characters. Veblen, the main character, she's the quirky one. She has a quirky house, quirky childhood stories involving carrying around a typewriter. She likes to talk to squirrels. She's obsessed with her namesake, the economist Thorsten Veblen, and she's also a Norwegian translator. And Veblen is engaged to Paul, who's this ambitious neurobiologist and the more straight-laced of the duo. So Veblen and Paul obviously have a lot of differences, but from the way this book is written, you can really tell that they love each other, but just have to sort of learn to communicate better. And so a lot of this book, the plot revolves around their relationship and how they interact with each other once they've gotten engaged. But I feel like they just needed to sort of try to communicate better to figure out their differences. But there's none of the melodrama and willful deception that I'm so used to seeing in love stories. They both just seem a little insecure. And what they seem the most insecure about, other than their relationship, are their parents and families. And both sets of families were well fleshed out with their own sort of quirks and problems, just like the main characters, which is good because the story would have failed without such engaging characters, because this is mainly a character story. And so I went between finding it funny and a little sad, and I think for the reader it's really a matter of perspective. Sometimes the characters felt more like caricatures, and the story sort of teetered on the edge of serious and satire. Some of the problems that I had with this novel were the squirrels talking back and seeming to understand Veblen, which I thought was a little bit of a cop-out. I think I would have enjoyed it more if we never really had that indication that the squirrels could, like, understand and talk. I thought that was a little bit much. Also, there were a lot of references to Veblen the philosopher, and I know nothing about Thorsten Veblen or his economics or anything like that, so that was confusing because I'd never really heard of him. Also, there were a lot of technical neurobiology terms which just made me go, why? I don't understand! But overall, I thought this novel was engaging and quirky with an edge of humor and sadness. And I gave The Portable Veblen 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was Truth Witch by Susan Dennard. And so this is a young adult fantasy novel, and it is about this young woman, Safi, who is a truth witch and sort of has the power to tell if people are lying or telling the truth. And She and her thread sister are on the run because people want to take advantage of her powers and marry her off and all of these things, so it's really a little bit of a fantasy adventure story. And a lot of people have been really raving about the world building in this novel, but I really didn't find it that great. It seemed like the systems of magic could have been interesting, but nothing was ever really made clear about how it worked or why, and it was really confusing at first and never made sense to me. There was nothing really ever said about the world itself other than some random city and country names that were really given no context except for the fact that there was a 20-year peace treaty that was about to expire. Safi, the main character, wasn't really very interesting, and I didn't really care about her powers. They seemed sort of useless. Merrick, her love interest, who she falls in love with instantly, is boring as well. He's just an annoying alpha male the entire time, trying to prove what an alpha male he is. And it was honestly annoying and frustrating. I was more interested in Safi's uncle and Safi's thread sister, Isolde. They both seemed like they had more interesting stories than Safi, but it was nice to see a strong female friendship between the two girls. The plot was also silly and a bit played out. There was constant action until about 2/3 of the way through, which is when we finally get some character moments, but by that time, it's almost a little too late, and it just gets wasted on the boring romance. But overall, the book kept me hooked and interested, and I'll probably check out the next one. So I gave Truth Witch 3 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read in March is Eleanor by Jason Gurley. So this novel is a little bit hard to describe. It basically focuses on 3 generations of a family. So there's Eleanor, and then there's Agnes, who's Eleanor's daughter, and then Agnes also has a daughter whose name is Eleanor. So the bulk of this story is about Eleanor, Agnes's daughter, who is about 14 when the novel begins. So in this novel, there are really strong themes of grief, family, and mental illness that were so profound and well written that this book made for an emotional and sort of unsettling read that stuck with me long after I finished it. So there are also strong elements of magical realism and sci-fi, so if you do read this book, you have to be prepared for the weird. I empathized so much with Eleanor and everything she was feeling and experiencing. Everything about her resonated so much with me, and I was so invested in her as a character. But the book wasn't just about Eleanor, it also had a huge emphasis on family and how the choices they make can resonate through generations. So I highly recommend this book. I really enjoyed it, and I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read in March is Ways to Disappear by Idra Novi. So this novel is a bit of a thriller novel. So Emma, the main character, is a Portuguese translator, but she only translates the novels of one author, Beatriz, who lives in Brazil. And so when Beatriz goes missing, Emma uproots her life and just sort of goes down to Brazil to help look for her, even though Beatriz's adult children don't really want her there and don't understand why she thinks she's going to be able to help find Beatriz. So then that's what this novel is about. And so this is Novi's first novel, as she previously wrote poetry. I thought it was very well written, and I love the language that the author used, but quotation marks seem to be optional, so that was a little bit jarring and took a little bit to get used to. The main character, Emma, I was really worried about her mentally and physically because she was big on avoidance of her problems at home that weren't really problematic. So you could tell she really didn't want to be in Pittsburgh and was almost looking for an excuse to torpedo her life. The way she talks about Beatriz indicates that she finds Beatriz's strange ideas and stories that are in her novels preferable to her own somewhat boring life. Emma felt almost unnecessary to the drama of finding Beatriz, and in the end she is a bit superfluous. But interestingly, Emma's outsider status seems to help, but in the end it's Beatriz's daughter who's the most important. I found it interesting that neither of Beatriz's children had ever read their mother's works, and those are the works that made Emma feel like she knew Beatriz well enough to be able to track her down when she goes missing. So as I said, this book is a thriller as the main plot is about looking for Beatriz, but that need to look for her felt almost subdued until the last third of the novel, when things really pick up and there's a little bit more action. I felt that the mystery of where Beatriz had disappeared to and the high-stakes drama of paying off her gambling debts were disconnected in a way, and it seemed shitty of her to leave her children holding the bag for her mistakes. Her motivations are murky at best, which made for interesting reading as I was never really sure what was going to happen. But it meant I didn't have a lot of sympathy for the characters. However, I still found this to be a very compelling read and one that I read in about 2 days. So overall, I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read in March is The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. And this book was my favorite book that I read this month. It is a sci-fi character story that takes place on a tunneling ship that is traveling a long way to a small angry planet to create a tunnel through space from far away back to where the center of their galaxy or government is. I'm not good at science, you guys. And luckily, this book did not require me to be. It's a lot more of a character story, and I thought it had really great world building, and the characters were all fabulous. And I actually did a full review of this novel, so I will link that down below if you want to see all my thoughts. But I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars, and I highly recommend it. The next book I read in March was The Hero of Ages by Brandon Sanderson, which is the conclusion to the Mistborn trilogy. So I don't want to spoil too much about the plot of this book or the previous books in the trilogy by talking too much about it, but I was a little frustrated by the first half of this book. It seemed like all the characters were sort of in a funk, and I felt like they should have been doing more. And also it seems like they should know more, or should be like doing more research. I don't know, it just seems like at the beginning of each chapter we sort of get like a little blurb that seems like it's been like written after and has a lot of sort of important history, mythology, theology stuff that I feel like the characters need to know, and it made for frustrating reading a little bit at the beginning when I as the reader knew all of this information that the characters didn't. I just wanted to like tell them so that they could start like doing the right thing. I had a lot of feelings, and it gave me a little bit of a book hangover because it was so much. But overall, I thought it was a really good conclusion to the series, and yeah, I can't wait to pick up The Alloy of Law, which is the next book in the Mistborn series and starts its own sort of new set of novels that takes place like hundreds of years after the conclusion of this one. So I gave The Hero of Ages 4 out of 5 stars, and I thought it was a great conclusion. The next book that I read this month is The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole, and I was not a fan of this book. It was written in the 18th century, late 18th century, and it is the first Gothic novel that was ever written. And I read this book because I visited Horace Walpole's home in London, Strawberry Hill, and I felt like it seemed appropriate, but I really did not like this. I like to read classic novels, and I've been reading a lot of them lately, so I'm better at reading them now than I was in high school because I've gotten used to the writing style of older writers, but this was just really difficult to get through. It was also formatted terribly, like literally it's just like blocks of text. There are no quotation marks, there are no even new paragraphs anytime anyone speaks. At least in Ways to Disappear, there weren't quotation marks, but there was a new line anytime someone new spoke, so you at least knew who was talking, you knew when dialogue had started. That was not the case in this book. Also, I didn't really find it engaging or anything at all, although I guess good for you, Horace Walpole, for writing the first Gothic literature book, because I like Gothic fiction. I think it's fun, so I guess that's why I felt the need to read this, to sort of see where it all came from. So I guess it evolved in a good way after this. So, wasn't a fan. 2 out of 5 stars. And the last book that I read this month is The Tower of Thorns by Juliette Marillier. So this is the second book in Juliette Marillier's Blackthorn and Grimm series. The first one is called Dreamer's Pool. And I quite liked this book. Just like Dreamer's Pool, it was a bit of a slow read. It's a lot more about characters and just sort of solving the solving the mystery and a lot about backstory and stuff, which I really liked. I thought it was nice to have a bit of a slower read after some of the action-packed books that I read this month. So Blackthorn is a wise woman living in sort of a fantasy version of Ireland, and in this novel, she and her partner Grim are sent to the town of Ban to sort of figure out what's going on there, because in the Tower of Thorns, the tower right there is a monster that basically screams all day and has been screaming for the past year and a half, or the past 2 years, and Blackthorn is sort of charged with figuring out what's going on and like killing the monster so that, and lifting this curse that's on the land to sort of make everything go back to normal. So I thought this was a really cool and interesting read, and so in this novel there are 3 point of view characters. There's Blackthorn, the wise woman, and Grim, who's sort of her companion slash bodyguard slash bestie, who everyone sort of thinks is a little bit like dim-witted and slow. And then the 3rd point of view character is Galus, who is the Lady of Ban and who's the one who has asked Blackthorn to come and take care of this. And so I thought the writing in this, I thought it was really great. You could definitely tell the difference between each different point of view character. Even if it wasn't labeled at the beginning of the chapter, you would sort of know, because Blackthorn and Grim really have distinct voices that you get just through the writing. I thought Galus and her story were very interesting, and it was a little bit predictable, but then there was like this huge twist at the end that I did not see coming. Like, I knew there was going to be a twist because it was a little foreshadowed, but I had no idea what the twist was going to be. So when it happened, I was like, oh my god! So I like this one a little bit more than I liked Dreamer's Pool, because in Dreamer's Pool the twist I thought was a little bit predictable, but in this one it was not as predictable. And I thought it was really good. I really like how Juliette Marillier sort of weaves fairy tales and mythology into her world, and I'm really looking forward to the next book in this series. Alright, so that's all that I read for March. Please let me know if you read any of these books or plan on reading any of these books. I would love to talk to you about them down in the comments, or you can check out my Goodreads page. I post full reviews there for every book that I read, and you can see what I'm reading at all times. Okay, so I will talk to you all soon. Goodbye!